Hello, my name's Sarah Lambert. I'm a Research and Outcomes Officer at RCSLT, and I'm presenting today also on behalf of my colleague Catherine Moyes and Katie Chadd, who used to work with us but is now at the University of Essex. So a reminder, this session is about real-world data, and what we mean by that is routine clinical information, so not data that's been collected as part of controlled research trials. And a reminder of the route. So it was developed to help SLTs record their outcomes data and importantly to then analyse this alongside other clinical information. And when the process was begun to look at sort of producing this online tool for the profession, RCSLT members agreed on therapy outcome measures as the best fit outcome measure to use for that. As you can see, we've had a steady increase in uptake to the route. So we've got 82 services now using the tool, and they range from big NHS trusts to independent sole traders. So the focus for Root is really about driving improvement at a service level, but it can also support individual clinical decision making. And it's now generating an increasing amount of real world data. So there's that potential there to actually produce real world evidence to complement more traditional research. So in terms of health inequalities, work in the RCSLT generally on this issue highlighted that there might be some potential for Root to support members with this, but it was missing the key fields that they would need to do that. And so our outcomes steering group agreed to a pilot to explore this further based on the objectives on the slide. We recruited 7 Root sites to the project to take part in this. 6 were NHS trusts, 1 was a charity that provided NHS commissioned services, 1 from Wales, 1 from Scotland, the rest from England. We did have a mix of kind of adult and children and young people services, but most of the ones from England were specialist services. We did try to get a more diverse range of services. So we obviously really wanted a service from Northern Ireland and an independent service, but we weren't successful in managing to do that, unfortunately. So there's a brief overview of the sort of outline of the project on the slide, and I'm now going to talk about each of these aspects kind of in light of the evaluation that took part at the end of that took place at the end of that. So the fields that the group agreed on were patient ethnicity, using whatever categories were being used in that service, the deprivation decile from the index of multiple deprivation relevant to the nation that service is in, whether or not the patient and family need an interpreter, and then a summary of their kind of language profile, which we'll see later on. So our original intention was to have 1 set of fields across the UK, but once we started the project, it became clear quite quickly that wasn't realistic because of the variation that exists, firstly between different services, but also between different nations, so different, especially if they want to compare with local population data. There's obviously different indices of multiple deprivation, different variations around the UK. In terms of terminology, the services were really keen to know about the patient and family language use and their kind of exposure to other languages, but it was really difficult to agree exactly what information we could actually code for. And there was a feeling that a lot of the sort of existing terms that systems and things might use around kind of preferred language, first language, main language, that most of those were not adequate. There was also a bit of reservation around using the postcode, recognition that the index of multiple deprivations can't tell us how deprived an actual individual or household is. It's only about the area where they live. But we knew we did want to capture something about deprivation because of its impact on health outcomes, and there just wasn't a viable alternative to that. There were other fields that were suggested, but they tended to be more specific, sort of maybe to children's services. So we agreed that they weren't in scope for this project, but that services could add them to their own route base if they wanted to. Not all the services decided to collect all the data for all 4 fields, but some were also able to re-upload older data. So you can see here that we've got overall just under for language 3,000 episodes of care for in each field that have some data recorded. I think in practice the data collection was actually a little bit more straightforward than we might have expected from the amount of discussions that we had at the agreement stage. Most of the work was really around kind of systems and processes. Some services changed these to ensure, for instance, that data was collected routinely at the point of referral, maybe by admin staff, and that made a big difference. But there was still some uncertainty reported by clinicians when we did the evaluation about kind of asking patients for this information. And for deprivation, some services were using an online search tool, which was generally quite easy to use, but SLTs did find this an extra step. It didn't always work. And there was the kind of process of going on to a different system, maybe to check the patient's postcode and that kind of thing. So just logistical issues around that. This is an example. So when we come to actually analysing the data, this is a graphic that we developed to show the makeup of a service. So this is an example for ethnicity, potentially allowing for some comparison with local demographic data to consider whether there might be some unmet need. Or in this case, probably looking at it, the initial thing would be about the consistency of recording, because we've got 52% recorded as not known. And this is an example of one of the reports that services are able to run to actually look at the outcomes. So in this example, the top row are patients who were identified as not needing an interpreter, and the bottom is ones that did need an interpreter. So this gives the potential for the service to actually compare any differences between those groups, where green is that they improved in that domain of the TOM, the yellow is that they stayed the same, and the red is that they went down. Overall, members were positive about the pilot when we did the evaluation. They reported an increased awareness of the issues, but importantly, they didn't yet have examples of being able to use it effectively, the data effectively, either to identify inequality or be really confident about the equity of their service. There are a few kind of key reasons that were identified for that. Some sites had inputted a lot data for lots of patients, but still the numbers of patients in the kind of non-dominant group, in whatever area that might be, tended to be very small, and then therefore they still found it very hard to make comparisons and know what the significance would be if they did find a difference. A really key issue was having the confidence and above all the time and space to run the reports and sort of reflect on those findings with colleagues, and that reflects what we see generally with the route, that it's finding that time to really analyse the data. And also we found that there were particular challenges with obtaining the local population data sort of for your area and interpreting that and then comparing it. So RCSLTs had the opportunity to just have a bit of a look at the combined data for some of the different services in the pilot. Found that only a very small percentage of patients were recorded as using another language. As this was all the services collecting this category across Scotland, England and Wales, we might expect the total numbers to reflect the census findings for the population of those countries. So we had that 95.6% only spoke English or Welsh, so one of the national languages of the country. In Scotland, in the census in 2011, we didn't have the results of that, the most recent one yet, 92.6% only spoke English at home, so we can kind of compare that to that figure. So it does seem that we have a higher figure there. There's a slightly different question in the census in Wales. It asks about their main language. So 91.1% had English or Welsh if they were in Wales as their main language. So we could expect that the number of people who only spoke English or Welsh would be even lower than that 91.1%. So again, it makes our 95.6% look quite high. Obviously, we need to recognise this data came from, a few different areas, and there's a lot of local variation. So this comparison would be a lot more meaningful if we could if an individual service was comparing with the specific makeup of their local area. But we can consider the possibility that these results might indicate a level of unmet need, perhaps, where a lower proportion of patients who use another language are accessing the SLT services. However, there obviously are a lot of other possibilities, including under-recording. So in the initial data set, 60 additional patients were recorded as not known, and 711 had no data recorded for this. So it's possible maybe the SLTs were likely to record not known or kind of leave it blank where they weren't confident that the family only spoke English. And this really highlights the importance of data quality. Otherwise, it leaves us unable to draw those conclusions. And it also raises some questions around why SLTs didn't know the answer to those questions, when we would expect that for the purposes of patient care, they really need to have that detailed knowledge about the patient and family language use. We can also have a little look at difference in outcomes. So here we're just looking at services using the English index of multiple deprivation, because you can't directly compare the indices from the different nations. So we're just looking at services in England here. En route, some services also allocate each episode a direction of care. So for this analysis, we've just selected those patients where the services had indicated that they expected to see improvement. Knowing the impact that deprivation can have on health outcomes, we might expect to see some lower percentages in the bottom row in the patients who live in more deprived areas. However, we can see that the percentage across this table, the percentage of episodes resulting in some improvement, was fairly consistent across the different deciles, and there's no clear pattern relating to the level of deprivation in the area where they live. So that gives us a bit of an encouraging indication, but again, individual services would really need to look closely at their own results and consider all the much more nuanced elements of deprivation and the social determinants of health. So overall, the pilot findings suggest it will be valuable to open up these fields to other route users, but we need ongoing monitoring and evaluation as the services obtain more data and improve their consistency of data collection. Data analysis is challenging and it's often daunting for clinicians, but it can be hugely valuable for service improvement. And there's certainly no value in simply collecting the data and not analysing it. And we're really aware at RCSLT of the challenges of this, and really striving to support members. The topic of health inequalities is really complex, and it's definitely important that we don't oversimplify. Often people experience inequality because of a combination of issues, and services really need to consider the specifics in their local population. And ultimately, data collection and analysis is only going to form one very small part of what services can do to address health inequalities, and that's where our broader RCSLT guidance, including an audit tool, comes in. So I'm just going to leave up these acknowledgements, but please get in touch with us at root@rcslt.org if you want to have any more information, any of the links to some of the things that I've referred to in this presentation, or a copy of the slides. Thank you.